There is a photograph taken in America in the 1890s that is hard to look at once you understand what you are seeing. It shows a man standing on top of a hill. The hill is not made of earth, it is made of skulls. Bison skulls, stacked into a mound taller than a house, thousands upon thousands of them, waiting to be ground into fertilizer. Another man stands at the base, holding one skull in his hands, and between the two of them, there is a mountain of animals that were alive a short time earlier. That photograph is one small pile from one processing yard. Across the plains, there were bones like that everywhere, so many that collecting them became an industry of its own, with families making a living driving wagons across the grasslands gathering the bones of a species. At the start of that century, tens of millions of bison moved across North America, herds so vast that people who saw them ran out of language for it, describing a living carpet that took days to pass a single point, ground shaking under the weight of them. And by the time the killing was finished, when officials finally went out to count the wild bison left running free in the United States, the number they came back with was 23, not 23,000, 23 animals. A single small group hiding in a remote valley, and men with rifles were still hunting them. The place was Yellowstone, and the year was 1902. Yellowstone had been made a national park 30 years earlier, but for most of that time the protection existed mainly on paper. There was no serious law with teeth behind it, no meaningful punishment for killing animals inside the park boundary, and poachers knew it. The last free-ranging wild bison in the country had ended up sheltering in the interior of Yellowstone simply because it was rough, remote, and hard to reach. And even there, men were coming in after them. And there was a brutal economic reason they kept coming. The rarer the bison became, the more a bison head was worth. A mounted head could fetch a sum that was serious money at the time, because collectors and trophy hunters wanted one before they were gone forever. That is one of the darkest mechanisms in extinction. As an animal approaches the end, its value can go up, and the pressure to kill the last ones increases rather than decreases. The species was being hunted harder precisely because there were almost none left. The turning point came from a man being caught in the act. In the 1890s, a poacher was captured inside Yellowstone with bison he had killed, and a magazine reporter and photographer happened to be in the park and documented it. The story went out to the public, and Americans who had grown up hearing about the endless herds were confronted with the fact that a man could kill some of the last wild bison on Earth and face essentially no punishment. The outrage was strong enough that Congress passed a law specifically to protect the wildlife of Yellowstone, with real penalties attached. For the first time, killing a bison in that park could cost a person their freedom. But a law does not bring back animals, and 23 is not a population. 23 is a rounding error, a group small enough to be wiped out by one hard winter, one disease, or one determined group of men. To understand how a species that numbered in the tens of millions arrived at 23, you have to understand that this was not an accident, and it was not simply overhunting for meat. For thousands of years, bison were the center of life on the Great Plains. For the indigenous nations of that country, the animal was food, shelter, clothing, tools, fuel, and the heart of spiritual and cultural life. Hides became teepees and robes. Bones became implements. Sinew became thread. Nothing was wasted. Entire societies were built in balance with the movements of the herds, and had been for longer than any written record. Then, in the 1800s, several forces arrived at once. Industrial tanning methods turned bison hide into a valuable commodity that could be shipped east and made into machine belts and leather goods. Railroads pushed straight through the heart of the plains, which meant hunters could reach the herds easily and ship out hides by the ton. Commercial hunting parties went out and killed on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, sometimes taking only the hide or the tongue and leaving the rest of the animal on the ground to rot. And alongside that commercial slaughter ran something colder. Destroying the bison was understood, and in cases openly stated by military and political figures of the era, as a way to break the plains nations. Remove the animal, and you remove the food supply, the independence, and the ability of those nations to resist being confined to reservations. The killing of the herds was, in part, a strategy aimed at people. That is not a modern reinterpretation. It is in the words of men who were there. So the herds fell, decade by decade, and the plains emptied. Where there had been a living tide of animals, there were bones. And then not even bones, because those were collected too. Within a single human lifetime, one of the most abundant large animals on the planet was reduced to scattered survivors. And in the wild, in the United States, that meant 23 animals in one Yellowstone valley. What happened next is strange, because the people who saved the bison were, in many cases, exactly the people you would not expect. One of the most important was a man named William Hornaday, who was a taxidermist. In the 1880s, he was sent west by the Smithsonian to collect bison specimens, essentially to preserve examples of the animal for museums before it disappeared entirely. He went out to shoot bison for display cases, and what he found on that trip changed him completely. He had to search for a long time to find animals at all, and he came back understanding that he was documenting the final stage of a destruction. The man sent to stuff the last bison became one of the fiercest advocates for saving them. Hornaday went on to help found the American Bison Society, with the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, serving as its honorary head. Roosevelt himself had hunted bison in the West as a young man and had seen the emptiness left behind. Meanwhile, a scattered handful of private individuals had already done the quiet, unglamorous thing that made recovery possible at all. Across the plains, a small number of ranchers and indigenous families had captured or raised a few bison calves in the last years of the slaughter and kept them alive. There were only a few of these private herds, built from a tiny number of founding animals, held on ranches in Texas, Montana, South Dakota, and elsewhere. They were not conservation programs in any modern sense. Some were curiosities, some were business ventures, some were personal obsessions. But when the moment came that anyone wanted to rebuild a wild population, those few dozen privately held animals were the only genetic material left in the world to do it with. Yellowstone used them. The park bought bison from private herds and brought them in to supplement the 23 survivors, and established a ranch inside the park where bison could be bred and protected under guard. The wild remnant and the purchased animals eventually mixed, and the herd began, slowly, to grow. And then came one of the most surreal moments in the history of American conservation. The Bronx Zoo in New York City had been breeding bison. In 1907, 15 of those animals were crated up, loaded onto a train, and shipped from New York to a wildlife refuge in the Wichita Mountains of Oklahoma. Bison born in a zoo in the largest city in the country were carried by rail out onto the southern plains to re-establish a wild herd on ground where the species had been exterminated. People came out to watch the crates arrive. The animals were released, and they lived, and they bred, and their descendants are still there. Something similar happened in Montana, where a national bison range was established and stocked with animals bought from a private herd. Piece by piece, herd by herd, bison were placed back onto fragments of the land they had been erased from. And here the story takes a turn that most retellings skip entirely. So if the real ending of this one is what you want, take a moment to subscribe, because the number of bison alive today sounds like a total victory, and the truth behind that number is not what you would expect. Ask how many bison there are in North America now, and you will get a figure in the hundreds of thousands. Compared to 23 wild animals in 1902, that sounds like one of the greatest comebacks in history. But look closely at what those animals actually are. The overwhelming majority of bison alive today are livestock. They are privately owned, raised commercially on ranches, primarily for meat. They live behind fences, they are selected and managed like cattle, and they are not part of any wild ecosystem. They are the reason the species did not vanish, and they are also, in the strictest sense, a farm animal population rather than a restored wild one. The number of bison in genuine conservation herds, animals managed to be wild and to serve an ecological role, is far smaller, in the range of tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. And those herds are scattered across a small number of parks, refuges, and tribal lands, occupying a tiny fraction of the range this species once filled. Ecologists sometimes describe the bison as ecologically extinct, meaning the animal still exists, but the thing it used to do, moving in enormous herds across an entire continent and shaping the grassland as it went, no longer happens anywhere. And what the bison used to do mattered enormously. A herd on the move grazed hard and then left, which is completely different from cattle standing in one pasture. And that pattern of intense grazing, followed by long recovery, is what the prairie grasses evolved with. Bison rolled in the dirt, carving out shallow depressions called wallows, and those hollows collected rainwater and became temporary pools where amphibians bred and specialized plants grew. Their hooves broke the soil surface and pressed seeds into the ground. Their dung fed insects, which fed birds. Their carcasses fed scavengers. Where they wintered and where they calved shaped which plants grew, which meant it shaped which birds nested and which predators hunted. The grassland was not simply a place that bison happened to live in. It was, to a large degree, a landscape the bison were continuously building. Remove the animal and the grass remains, but the machine that maintained the system is switched off. There is a genetic problem underneath that as well. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, some of the ranchers who kept bison deliberately crossbred them with cattle, trying to create a hardier animal for the plains. Those experiments largely failed as businesses, but the genes did not disappear. Most bison herds today carry at least small traces of cattle ancestry as a result. A small number of herds, including the one in Yellowstone, are considered free of detectable cattle genes, which makes them enormously valuable, and it also means the genetic foundation of the species is narrower than the raw population number suggests. Then there is the conflict that continues to this day. Many Yellowstone bison carry brucellosis, a disease that originally came into North American wildlife from imported cattle. Ranchers in the surrounding region fear transmission back to their livestock, and so bison that wander out of the park in winter, following the same instinct to move to lower ground that their ancestors followed, are hazed back or captured. In some years, large numbers of Yellowstone bison have been removed, and the argument over how to handle it has been running for decades without a comfortable answer. The last wild herd is still, in a real sense, hemmed in by an invisible boundary. But there is one part of the modern story that genuinely does feel like the ending this animal deserved. The bison is coming home to the nations it was taken from. Over the past few decades, an alliance of dozens of tribes across the United States has worked to bring bison back to tribal lands, and it has grown into one of the most significant restoration efforts on the continent. Instead of surplus Yellowstone bison being sent to slaughter, programs now quarantine and test animals and transfer them to tribal nations, where they are released onto large tracts of grassland. Communities that lost the animal in the 19th century, in a campaign designed to break them, have spent the last generation bringing it back, and treaties have been signed between tribes and First Nations across the United States and Canada, committing to bison restoration together. That is a different kind of recovery than a population number. It is the return of a relationship that was deliberately severed. So the honest picture is this: the American bison did not go extinct, and given where it stood in 1902, that alone is remarkable. A species reduced in the wild to 23 animals in one valley, guarded by soldiers, propped up by a handful of ranch herds and a shipment of zoo animals from New York City, is alive today in numbers no one in that era would have believed. But it has not been restored to what it was. Most of them are farm animals. The wild herds are small, fenced, managed, and genetically narrow. The great continental migration is gone and is not coming back. What did come back is the animal itself, and the possibility of everything else. Go to Yellowstone in winter now and you will see bison standing in snow with frost on their beards, breath steaming, swinging their heads to sweep drifts off the grass, exactly as they did before any of this happened. Every one of them traces back through a bottleneck so tight it should have closed. 23 wild animals in a remote valley, worth more dead than alive, hunted right up to the final years, and someone decided that was not going to be the end of it. Somewhere in the 1890s, a man stood on a mountain of skulls and had his photograph taken, and it looked like the last word on the subject. It was not. The herds that walk the plains today, small and fenced and complicated as they are the direct descendants of the animals that were still standing when that photograph was taken, and of the people who refused to let the count go from 23 to 0. If you enjoy true stories of species pulled back from the very edge, stories most people never hear, then like this video and subscribe. In the next one, we will follow another species the world had already written off. Take care of yourself and stay curious.